Imagine the moment when victory was not the end, but the beginning of a nightmare. It is May 29th, 1453. The ancient city of Constantinople had stood for over 1,000 years, protected by its towering walls. But now those walls crumble under the thunder of Ottoman cannons. The roar of gunpowder shakes the ground. Clouds of smoke rise into the sky, thick and suffocating. Men cry out as stone breaks apart and iron gates splinter. Inside the city, panic spreads like fire. Fathers and sons rush to the ramparts in a desperate last stand. Husbands leave their families behind, knowing they may never return. Church bells toll, not in celebration, but in mourning. The sound is heavy, like the heartbeat of a dying city. Women clutch their children in dark corners of their homes. They whisper prayers, but their words are drowned by the roar of battle. You are there. You smell the smoke. You hear the clash of steel. You feel the earth tremble beneath your feet. Your husband fights on the walls with nothing left to lose. And then, silence. He does not return. His body lies somewhere among the fallen, a name lost in the storm. But the true terror has not yet begun. Through the haze of smoke, shapes emerge. Ottoman soldiers march into the city. Their steps are slow, steady, deliberate. They are not searching for victory. Victory is already theirs. They are searching for something living, something that can be taken. You lock the wooden door of your home. You clutch your infant child to your chest. And in that moment you understand. For the men of Constantinople, death has come swiftly. But for its women and children, death would have been mercy. For the Ottomans, conquest was never just about land. It was about people. Every city taken meant more than walls and gold. It meant bodies. It meant souls. The empire had perfected a system colder than steel. They called it order, but for those who lived it, it was terror. When the gates of Constantinople opened, the process began. Soldiers fanned out across the streets. They moved with discipline, not chaos. This was not looting. This was harvesting. Families were dragged from their homes. Screams echoed through narrow alleys. Mothers held their children tight, refusing to let go. But the soldiers pulled them apart with brutal precision. The men and boys were the first to be judged. If they were old enough to fight, even barely, they were cut down. Those younger, if considered weak, were cast aside. The streets became rivers of blood. Yet even this was only the beginning. For the women, the fate was different. They were not seen as people. They were seen as stock, as property to be sorted, measured, and assigned value. In the public squares, groups of captives were forced to stand in rows. Nobles and officers observed like merchants at a market. A girl of 14 was considered prime, a woman of 25 still valuable. At 40, a sentence of labor. Beyond that, death without hesitation. It was written into policy, recorded in ledgers, and carried out with chilling calm. No screams could change it. No prayers could stop it. The machine of conquest turned without mercy, and in its path, humanity itself was stripped away. The sorting did not end with women. Children were taken too. Little boys under 6 were ripped from their mothers. They vanished into the dev-shirme system. They would be raised not as sons, but as soldiers of the empire. Their families would never see them again. Girls under 12 were sent into something far more cruel. They called it formation. It was a program designed to erase them. Their names were stripped away, their language forbidden, their childhood stolen. They were trained to serve in silence. They were reshaped until nothing of their past remained. And still, the Ottomans recorded everything. They wrote ledgers as if these were simple goods. A boy, age 5, assigned. A girl, age 10, reassigned. Every child a number, every number a prophet. Within 2 days of Constantinople's fall, nearly 50,000 people had been processed. 12,000 women and girls were forced onto ships bound for distant markets. 8,000 more were divided among the soldiers. Their captors called it reward. The victims called it ruin. On the docks, ship manifests were written with chilling precision. 15 females, ages 16 to 20, excellent condition. It was written beside the price of silk and spice. A life reduced to inventory. The city's fall had become industry. Conquest had become business. The soldiers marched on with plunder, But what they carried was not gold. It was humanity itself, bound and broken. And once taken, it would never return. The empire did not hide what it was doing. It was written into law. It was part of the system. Widows of fallen warriors were not left to grieve. They were claimed as war wives. No ceremony of choice. No word of refusal. Just possession. Conversion to Islam was demanded immediately. It was not gentle persuasion. It was public humiliation. Women were forced into ceremonies designed to break them. Tears and screams were mocked by soldiers. Resistance was answered with pain. Submission was demanded through torture. Even pregnancy became a weapon. Children born of conquest were not children of their mothers. They belonged to the empire. If the child was a boy, he could be raised to fight against his own blood. If the child was a girl, she could be raised to serve until her body gave out. Some were taken away at birth. Others were allowed to remain only to remind the mother that her body was no longer her own. The policy was clear. The intent was absolute. A conquered woman could never again belong to herself. She was property of the empire, her life recorded in registers like livestock. Every birth documented, every death noted, every scar ignored. This was not chaos. It was order by design, an order meant to erase entire generations, and to remind those who survived that survival was not freedom. It was only another form of captivity. Over time, the fear spread beyond the walls of Constantinople. Villages far away trembled at the sound of approaching hooves. Every family knew what the arrival of Ottoman raiders meant. It was not only battle, it was harvest. Parents began to take desperate measures. Some scarred their daughters deliberately. They cut faces. They burned skin. They disfigured beauty in hope it would protect them. Others hid children in cellars or caves. Entire communities built secret rooms beneath their homes. But hiding did not always save them. Soldiers knew the signs. They tortured the captives until someone revealed the hiding place. One scream was enough to betray a whole village, and once the hiding was exposed, the punishment was worse than the raid itself. Fathers were executed on the spot. Mothers were stripped in front of their children. The young were divided like spoils of war, and all of it was done in the name of empire. The Ottomans called it order. The villagers called it survival. But survival left scars that never healed. Even when the soldiers moved on, silence did not return. The emptiness of missing voices haunted the streets. Families were broken forever. Children never came back. Women never spoke again. The shadow of the raids stretched across entire regions. It became part of life. And in time, fear itself was enough to make people surrender before the soldiers even arrived. The machine of conquest never stopped. What began in Constantinople was repeated across 3 continents. From the Balkans to the Middle East, the process became routine. Every campaign brought not only soldiers but scribes and registers. The empire turned human life into paperwork. Bureaucrats counted people the way merchants counted goods. 1 column for silk, 1 column for spice, 1 column for women and children. Ledgers marked age, condition, and price. A girl of 16 in excellent health could be valued higher than a chest of jewels. A boy of 10 strong enough to work was noted as future profit. This was not seen as crime. It was seen as policy. Commanders were rewarded not only for victories in battle, they were rewarded for the numbers of captives delivered. The more valuable the harvest, the greater the prestige. And so conquest became industry. Ships were redesigned as floating prisons. Captives were packed into the dark holds, chained and silent. Many did not survive the journey. 15% died on average before reaching the markets. Yet, in the empire's eyes, these were acceptable losses. The survivors were stripped of names, clothing, and dignity. They became property. They became numbers. In the slave markets of Istanbul, Bursa, and Adrianople, their worth was measured openly. Banners announced prices. Traders inspected them like livestock. The empire built its wealth on this foundation. The suffering of thousands turned into coins and power, and the cycle continued again and again with every new conquest. The empire did not simply conquer with swords. It conquered with fear. Psychological warfare was woven into every act. Communities learned that resistance meant annihilation. But surrender did not guarantee safety. Even peaceful submission ended in the same separation, The same loss. Women still taken. Children still processed. Fathers still executed. The message was clear. No one was beyond reach. And so fear itself became the most powerful weapon. Whole towns gave up before the first shot was fired. They opened their gates not to survive, but to lessen the pain. Yet mercy never came. In the public squares, women were still divided by age. Children still tagged and numbered. Soldiers still took what they wanted. The villagers stood in silence, powerless to protect their own. Even the memory of resistance began to fade. Generations grew up under the shadow of harvest raids. Mothers told stories to their daughters, warning them to hide, to remain unseen, to never trust the quiet of night. Fathers whispered to their sons that bravery could not stop the empire. The fear reached so deep that it outlived the battles themselves. Even after soldiers left, silence lingered. The echo of boots on stone, the cry of children dragged away, the sound of doors broken down, these became part of the land. It was no longer only history, it became identity. The empire thrived not only on conquest, it thrived on the memory of terror it left behind. The Ottomans built entire systems to manage what they had taken. It was not random cruelty, it was structure. Breeding centres were established to increase the supply of captives. Medical facilities monitored women as if they were livestock. Registers tracked every pregnancy, every birth, every death. Nothing was left unrecorded. A girl could be listed in the books from the moment she was captured. Her fate would be traced until the day she died. She was not seen as a person. She was seen as inventory. The empire turned bodies into resources, and families into statistics. Scribes sat with ink and parchment while lives were destroyed around them. They wrote columns and numbers without emotion. The system was efficient. The system was merciless. Women were forced to give birth to children they could never claim. Those children were removed, raised by strangers, erased from their heritage. Some were molded into soldiers, others into servants, and the cycle of exploitation continued with every generation. The archives revealed chilling detail. One record notes the transfer of 15 women in prime condition. Another lists the death of 3 infants during transport, dismissed as acceptable loss. Even suffering was measured and filed away. It was not hidden, it was not denied. It was written in the language of bureaucracy. The empire's greatest cruelty was not only in the act itself, it was in the normalization of that act. Conquest became industry. Exploitation became law. And entire peoples disappeared into the silence of the registers. The legacy of this system was not measured only in lives lost. It was measured in lives reshaped. Children raised by the empire no longer knew their origins. They spoke a different language. They prayed to a different god. They carried the weapons of the very soldiers who had destroyed their homes. And when they fought, they did not know they were striking their own blood. Mothers lived with the memory of children taken. Their arms remained empty, even years later. Some never spoke again. Others whispered names to the wind, hoping that somehow their voices would be carried to the children they had lost. But the children never returned. Generations vanished into the machinery of conquest. And still, the ledgers grew. One column for the living, one column for the dead, one column for the unborn. Every detail recorded, but never the truth of what it meant. Because no ink could capture the silence left behind. No parchment could hold the weight of a mother's grief. The empire wrote numbers. History preserved documents. But the voices of those who lived it were erased. And so the record we have today is incomplete. It is fragments. It is shadows. It is memory distorted through time. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not only what was done, it is what will never be fully known. Because silence, once created, endures longer than screams. And in that silence, the past refuses to let go. The legacy of this system was not measured only in lives lost. It was measured in lives reshaped. Children raised by the empire no longer knew their origins. They spoke a different language. They prayed to a different god. They carried the weapons of the very soldiers who had destroyed their homes. And when they fought, they did not know they were striking their own blood. Mothers lived with the memory of children taken. Their arms remained empty, even years later. Some never spoke again. Others whispered names to the wind, hoping that somehow their voices would be carried to the children they had lost. but the children never returned. Generations vanished into the machinery of conquest. And still, the ledgers grew. One column for the living, one column for the dead, one column for the unborn. Every detail recorded, but never the truth of what it meant. Because no ink could capture the silence left behind. No parchment could hold the weight of a mother's grief. The empire wrote numbers. History preserved documents. But the voices of those who lived it were erased. And so the record we have today is incomplete. It is fragments. It is shadows. It is memory distorted through time. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not only what was done, it is what will never be fully known. Because silence, once created, endures longer than screams. And in that silence, the past refuses to let go. The Ottoman archives remain. They hold records in ink that has not faded. Numbers carefully written, names replaced by descriptions. Young female, age 16. Boy, age 10, strong build. Widow, reassigned. Every life reduced to a line on parchment. And yet the paper feels colder than stone. It does not scream. It does not bleed. It does not cry. It simply records. For the empire, that was enough. But for those who lived through it, the truth was far heavier. The walls of the cities carried echoes of the night raids. The stones of the streets remembered the footsteps of soldiers, and the soil remembered the graves dug too quickly to mark. Generations passed, but the silence lingered. Even today, the stories survive only in fragments. A song sung in secret, a whisper of a grandmother telling her granddaughter to never trust the calm before nightfall. These fragments are like broken glass, sharp, incomplete, impossible to piece together fully. They remind us of lives lived, but never whole. History often remembers the conquerors, their palaces, their battles, their monuments. But history forgets the women in the ledgers, the children in the manifests, the villages erased without leaving a single name behind. And maybe that is the greatest cruelty, to suffer and then to vanish, to be forgotten except as numbers, to be remembered not as people, but as property. The cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. A mother forced to serve the very men who killed her husband. A child raised to forget his name. A village that surrendered without a fight, only to be broken anyway. This quiet cruelty spread further than armies ever could. It seeped into memory. It seeped into blood. Entire cultures reshaped themselves around fear. Fathers taught their sons to never speak too proudly. Mothers warned their daughters to never be noticed. Even laughter became dangerous. Even beauty became a risk. Generations lived not for freedom, but for invisibility. And the empire thrived on that silence. Its power did not come only from weapons. It came from the absence of resistance. When people stopped fighting, the conquest was complete. But even without swords, the wounds continued. The loss of language, the loss of faith, the loss of family. These were scars that no healer could mend. The empire's palaces rose higher. Its armies marched farther. Its monuments stood taller. But in the shadows of those achievements lay the unseen, the broken lives, the forgotten voices, the faces never recorded. History preserved the grandeur, but history rarely preserved the grief. What we know today is incomplete. What we feel is only a shadow. And perhaps that is the truest measure of conquest. Not the lands it takes, but the silences it leaves behind. The scars of empire did not vanish with time. They remained etched into families. A mother who lost her child passed down only silence. A father who saw his village burned carried that silence to the grave. Their children inherited the fear without knowing its origin, and so fear became tradition. It was woven into lullabies. It was hidden in prayers. It was spoken in warnings whispered by candlelight. Do not be loud. Do not be seen. Do not be remembered. Because to be remembered was to be taken. The conquerors left monuments of stone, but the conquered left monuments of silence. Invisible, but lasting. Every city still standing carried echoes of what had been done. Every ruined wall still whispered of raids long past. The empire may have believed it erased its victims, but the victims remained in shadows. They lived in the stories half told. They lived in the dreams that woke children crying. They lived in the way people bowed their heads at the mention of soldiers, and they lived in the fragments of records still preserved today. A list of names without faces, a column of numbers without meaning, but to those who understand, each number is a life. Each number is a memory torn away. The tragedy was not only in the suffering itself, it was in the attempt to make that suffering vanish, to bury it beneath ink and stone, to let it fade into silence. But silence has weight, and silence endures. Centuries have passed since the fall of Constantinople. The empire that once seemed eternal is gone. Its palaces are ruins. Its armies are dust. But the silence it created has never left. It lingers in forgotten villages. It lingers in the gaps of history. It lingers in the absence of names that should have been remembered. We walk today through streets that once ran with fear. We see monuments built from the wealth of conquest. We hear stories told in fragments, never whole. And we sense that behind the glory of empire lies a darkness rarely spoken. The archives preserve details, dates, ledgers, numbers, but they cannot preserve the faces. They cannot preserve the voices. They cannot restore what was lost. Perhaps that is why this story feels unfinished. We know the cruelty, we know the system, but we do not know the people who lived and died within it. We only glimpse them in the margins of history. A line on a page, a whisper in a song, a shadow in memory. And so the past does not end. It waits. It waits in silence. It waits in the spaces history chose not to fill. And maybe that silence is the loudest reminder of all, not of what we can prove, but of what we may never truly know.